Rand Paul just took to the Senate floor and exposed John McCain for who he really is. On Monday, the Senate voted to move forward with admitting Montenegro into NATO, which makes the U.S. responsible for the nation's defense if it is attacked. This is a huge mistake. The only senators that stood up and said no were Mike Lee and Rand Paul, both Republicans. John McCain is a traitor to our people. The entire Senate is. This is why we need to drain the swamp. Rand Paul took to the floor and gave a rousing speech to give reasoning for why we shouldn't admit Montenegro into NATO. This vote essentially gives Congress a blank check to send our children into war. Nobody wanted to have this debate, Paul said. They want a rubber stamp and they want to send your kids to war with no debate. This is disgraceful. Let's take a listen here.
Forbid amendments. You know, I forced this debate. Nobody wanted to have this debate. They want a rubber stamp, they want no debates, and they want to send your kids to war with no debate. Today
Isn't this incredible? President Trump said in his inaugural address that we defend other nations' borders while refusing to defend our own. Paul noted, giving a nod to the president's campaign promises to put America first. I think he was right, Paul said. Let's take a listen.
President Trump said in his inaugural address that we've defended other nations' borders while refusing to defend our own.
That's right.
I think he was right. Today, the question is, will we add another commitment to defend yet another foreign country? For decades, NATO has been an organization where the U.S. disproportionately spends our blood and our treasure. The other NATO countries have largely hitched a ride on a U.S. train that subsidizes their defenses and allows them to direct their revenues to their own domestic concerns. In short, Uncle Sam is the Uncle Patsy for the rest of the world.
We could have one 15-minute vote on an amendment, Paul said, but they don't want to debate it because they're embarrassed that they're sending your sons and daughters to war without ever debating or voting on it. Should the U.S. fight other countries' wars? Rand Paul on NATO.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
President Trump said in his inaugural address that we've defended other nations' borders while refusing to defend our own. I think he was right. Today, the question is, will we add another commitment to defend yet another foreign country? For decades, NATO has been an organization where the U.S. disproportionately spends our blood and our treasure. The other NATO countries have largely hitched a ride on a U.S. train that subsidizes their defenses and allows them to direct their revenues to their own domestic concerns. In short, Uncle Sam is the Uncle Patsy for the rest of the world. The question today is, adding another country with less than 2,000 soldiers, is that adding them to NATO, will that be in our self-interest? Less than 2,000 soldiers, small country in a distant part of the world, will they make you sleep safer at night? The answer is an emphatic no. There is no national security interest that an alliance with Montenegro will advance. If we invite Montenegro into NATO, it will be a one-way street with the U.S. committing to defend yet another country and you, the taxpayer, being stuck with the bill. Even the advocates of Montenegro joining NATO admit as much. The Senate hearing on admitting Montenegro to NATO was really just a punching session about Russia. Not one word was said about allowing Montenegro into NATO or how it would advance our own national security. We were going to send a message to Russia. Even the citizens of Montenegro are divided on this. About half of them want to be in NATO, and the other half don't want to be in NATO. But it isn't really about them. It's about us. Is admitting Montenegro to NATO good for us? Our national security is our national security. Is Montenegro going to defend the United States? Are they of any importance to our national security? Or perhaps will they entangle us in local, historic, regional conflicts in the area? We must ask, is Montenegro an asset to the defense of the United States? That is the question at hand. The answer is a simple one. Admitting Montenegro to NATO will do nothing to advance our national security and will do everything to simply add another small country to the welfare wagon of NATO. Advocates for expanding NATO believe that unless the whole world joins NATO, Russia will conquer the world. But the truth is more nuanced. During the Cold War, the myth of Russian might was endlessly circulated here at home, and the effect was the production of endless munitions and ever-expanding debt. You're still paying the tab for that. The Cold War ended and the Soviet Union failed, not because our military might overcame them, but because our economic system outlasted them. They were defeated. Capitalism defeated socialism. If there is one message that Americans should get, capitalism is stronger than socialism. We should not flirt with political leaders in our country promoting what caused the Soviet Union to fail. But now we are told we must fear Russia again, fear the Russian bear. But if you look closely, you will see that Russian aggression around the world, and particularly among the former Soviet satellites, is an attempt to mask a weak economy that runs the same risk of overextension that caused the Soviet Empire to collapse. Russia is weak. Russia is weak because of corruption, oligarchy, human rights abuses. If Russia continues on this path, they may well encounter the same cataclysm that brought down the Soviet Empire. Without question, Russia is an adversary, a country that ignores international norms, does not respect the territorial integrity of their neighbors, and yet someone must ask, is it in our national interest to insist that countries of the former Soviet Union be in NATO? Because the debate today is not just about Montenegro. The same cheerleaders for Montenegro being in NATO want Ukraine in NATO. They want Georgia in NATO. This is about NATO expansion in general, and this is a chance to have a real debate. In Ukraine and Georgia, if both Ukraine and Georgia were in NATO today, we would be involved in a world war with Russia. Shouldn't someone speak up? Shouldn't we have some sort of national debate before we commit our sons and daughters to war in a faraway land? One thing is for certain. Russia will always care more about those lands than we will. Does that make Russian aggression right? Absolutely not. But our decision, the decision at hand, is are we willing to send our sons and daughters to fight in border disputes over Montenegro? Most Americans couldn't find Montenegro on the map. Are you willing to send your kids there to fight? That's what this is about. And this is sloughed over. They're going to forbid amendments. I forced this debate. Nobody wanted to have this debate. They want a rubber stamp. They want no debates. And they want to send your kids to war with no debate. Today they will pass this at my objection. When I finish this speech, I will ask for an amendment, and it will be denied because they do not want to debate whether your sons and daughters go to war. I find that appalling. I am ashamed of a Senate that will not have a debate and will not have a vote. From the very beginning, our republic was founded on a deep suspicion of entangling alliances. Our founders wanted to do everything possible to avoid the endless chronic wars in Europe. In Europe for centuries, kings from one nation fought their brothers and their cousins in other nations. This meaningless fratricide continued even into the 20th century. The founding fathers were emphatic in their desire to avoid endless war. Washington wrote that our true policy is to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world. Jefferson echoed this when he famously wrote that peace commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Even in modern times, such military heroes as President Eisenhower opposed intervention in Hungary, even when the naked aggression of the Soviets was appalling. Eisenhower likely may have had no real opportunity, though, because the Soviet Union had rolled in with 200,000 troops and 4,000 tanks. But at least part of the decision not to go into Hungary in the 50s was not for lack of sympathy for freedom, not for lack of sympathy for self-determination of a country, but it was the realpolitik decision of a nuclear confrontation with a nuclear Russia. Fast forward to today. For 16 years we have been at war in the Middle East. 16 years. Our justified response, if I had been here, I would have voted for going after the people who attacked us on 9/11. Our justified response, though, has drug on and on. There are people fighting in the war who were not born on 9/11. The Congress voted after 9/11 to go to war. They voted to go after the people who planned and plotted the attacks on the Trade Center. That vote from 15 years ago is used to justify all war everywhere on the planet. There has been no meaningful debate on the wars we are currently involved in the Middle East. We currently fight illegally and unconstitutionally in the Middle East because your representatives are afraid to have a public debate. They will stifle debate at all costs, and they will broker no amendments. They will allow no amendments to occur. Our unrestricted, unvoted upon involvement in war everywhere informs my opposition to expanding NATO. Everyone likes to talk about NATO's Article 5 obligation to come to the defense of any NATO ally is attacked. That is in the treaty. If Montenegro is attacked, we will have to respond. But my concern is that many in Congress believe that Article 5, saying that we have to defend Montenegro, that this farms out this power to declare war to an international body, and they don't think they have to vote again. You don't believe me? They haven't voted for 15 years for war, and we are still at war. We continue to go to new countries at war with no vote. You think that Montenegro won't be attacked and there won't be a war without a vote? This is their history. Their history is one of not obeying the Constitution. David Fromkin puts it this way: if it is now agreed by treaty that an attack on a NATO ally is deemed an attack on the United States, then it can be argued that the president is empowered without congressional authorization to send us to war. Don't believe me? We've been at war for 15 years. We've been at war with dozens of new tribes, dozens of new countries, with no vote on war. The most important vote a legislator will ever take is whether or not to go to war. And yet today we will vote for an automatic war if somebody invades Montenegro. And mark my words, they won't obey the Constitution. They'll say, we voted to put them in NATO. Article 5 says we have to defend them. That's not the law of the land, and you should have to vote in Congress, but nobody obeys the law. So if you're worried whether your kids will be sent to the Balkans or your kids will be sent to Ukraine or Georgia, call your representative and tell them stop. This is the crux of the debate. Congress has abdicated its role in declaring war. For 16 years, we've been at war in the Middle East, dozens of different tribes in dozens of countries, and yet no vote. People say, well, we should fight ISIS. Well, let's vote on it. Let's declare war or not. But you can't tell me that ISIS has anything to do with 9/11. They don't. Many of their fighters weren't even born then. The authorization for war in Iraq was specific to a specific enemy in a specific place. So was the authorization after 9/11. The authorization for war in Afghanistan was specific, and it says, directed against necessary and appropriate force against those who planned, authorized, committed, or aided the September 11th attacks. They actually put in the authorization for force that it was about 9/11. None of what's going on is about 9/11 anymore. They're not the same people. Some of the people we're fighting now didn't like those people. There's a whole confusing set of religious wars that have been going on 1,000 years in the Middle East, and yet your representatives will say, send me your son, send me your daughter, but we don't have time to vote on whether it should be a declared war or not. This vote is now used to justify a war around the globe, the vote from 9/11, from 15 years ago. It is a lie, and it is a disservice to our young men and women to have them fight under false pretenses, where the senators don't seem to have time to have a debate. No active war anywhere around the globe that the U.S. is involved with has been authorized by Congress. We dropped more bombs the other day in Pakistan. We sent a man raid into Yemen. Raise your hand if you know what the hell's going on in Yemen and who's fighting whom and who is our enemy. The one we killed the other day was Al-Qaeda, probably a bad guy. He was actually fighting against the Houthis, who were also fighting against. Who are the good guys? Shouldn't we have a debate? Shouldn't we decide whether we're going to war in Yemen? Should we be giving the Saudis bombs? They bombed a funeral procession. They killed 150 civilians and 500 people. We just let it go on. We keep giving them weapons. I tried to stop selling bombs to the Saudi Arabians. The majority up here says keep giving them to them. Keep giving them and let them indiscriminately kill whoever the hell they want. So NATO, should we expand it? Perhaps what we should do is make it clear that the NATO treaty is not a blind, open-ended promise to go to war anywhere, anytime. So before we go to final passage, I will offer one amendment. This amendment will be blocked because they do not want debate and because they will be embarrassed if they have to vote against this amendment. But realize what this amendment asks. My amendment states that nothing in the NATO treaty, particularly the Article 5 promise to come to the rescue of anyone attacked, none of this can happen without an official vote to declare war. So what is my amendment stating? The Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, says we don't go to war without a vote and a debate. You know what they'll do to get around it? But I think you can assume that this is what they're against the Constitution because they're not going to allow the amendment. How long would it take? It takes 15 minutes to vote around here. I'm about done speaking. We could have one 15-minute vote on an amendment. I'd grant back the time if we'd have the vote. But they don't want to debate it because they're embarrassed that they're sending your sons and daughters to war without ever debating or voting on it. This to me is a tragedy. It's sad to me. It makes me ashamed of the body that we will do this. Probably what's worse is then they clamor to the floor, their mouths agape, ajar, calling other people traitors, acting as if I care less about your sons and daughters because I want to have a debate on war before we go to war, preventing an amendment from happening, and then having the gall to come to the floor and accuse their philosophic opponents of being traitors and being allies with the Russians. Is this what we've come to? Is this where we are as America? That you can't take a principled stand against war? That you can't stand up on principle and say, are we really going to go to war over Montenegro, over Ukraine? Are we really going to go to war over Georgia? And you're accused of not being patriotic to your country? You know, I care as much as anybody about our soldiers. And when I talk to our young men and women who serve, you know what they tell me? They want someone to stand up and have a debate. They will do what they're told. Our soldiers are brave, and they will go where they are told, and they will obey orders. But the people here who are these mouthpieces for war, who think every soldier wants to go to war, go out and meet the soldiers and ask them whether they want the civilian senators to debate and have a formal declaration of war. That's all I'm asking for. 15 minutes and an amendment that says we will obey the Constitution. If Article 5 says we need to go to war and Montenegro's attacked, we will do the proper thing. We will come to the floor of the Senate. We're not sending troops to Montenegro without a vote. Is that too much to ask for? We'll see. With that, Mr. President, I'd like to call up my amendment that says that we should obey the Constitution and that we should declare war before we go to war. This would be amendment number 199.
Rand Paul is right. NATO adding Montenegro is a setup for the globalists to set up a war with Russia and then blame Trump as a Russian sympathizer when the time comes. Our politicians are lazy. They don't do their job. They need to be drained from Washington. If you remember, here is what John McCain said about Rand Paul.
If there is objection, and I note the senator from Kentucky on the floor, I will say before I read this, if there is objection, you are achieving the objectives of Vladimir Putin. You're achieving the objectives of trying to dismember this small country that has already been the subject of attempted coup. I have no idea why anyone would object to this, except that I will say, if they object, they are now carrying out the desires and ambitions of Vladimir Putin, and I do not say that lightly. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the Majority Leader in consultation with the Democratic Leader, the Senate proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 1, Montenegro Treaty Document 11-114-12, that the treaty be considered as having advanced through the various parliamentary stages up to and including the presentation of the resolution of ratification, that any committee declarations be agreed to as applicable, that there be no amendments in order to the treaty or the resolution of ratification, that there be 2 hours for debate, equally divided in the usual form. Upon the use of yielding back of time, the Senate proceed to vote on the resolution, that any statements be printed in the record as if read, that if the resolution of ratification is agreed to, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, that if the resolution is not agreed to, the treaty will be returned to the calendar, and that there be no motions or point of order in order, and a motion to reconsider, and then the Senate then resume legislative session.
Mr.
Is there
President,
Senator from Kentucky?
I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, I note the Senator from Kentucky leaving the floor without justification or any rationale for the action that he has just taken. That is really remarkable. That a senator blocking a treaty that is supported by the overwhelming number, perhaps 98 at least, of his colleagues, would come to the floor and object and walk away. And walk away. The only conclusion you can draw when he walks away is he has no argument to be made. He has no justification for his objection to having a small nation be part of NATO that is under assault from the Russians. So I repeat again, the senator from Kentucky is now working for Vladimir Putin. I yield the floor.
I think John McCain is senile. Let's drain the swamp. Let's get rid of every traitorous politician on the Hill. Let's start with John McCain. Give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below. John McCain, what a kook.